The Cedar Hills Awakening. My name is David Chen, and I learned that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. When the system fails, you don't abandon it. You fix it from within. My wife Sarah has always been the organizer, seeing patterns where others see chaos. Our son Michael, 16 and brilliant, taught us that courage isn't about fighting back. It's about standing up when it matters most. We lived in Cedar Hills, a planned community outside Portland that looked perfect on paper. Tree-lined streets, a community center, even a small lake. But perfection, we discovered, was maintained through fear and selective enforcement. The trouble started with a school board meeting in September. Michael had been documenting what he called educational inequity for a senior project, tracking how discipline policies affected different student populations. His research was thorough, devastating, and completely accurate. The data showed a clear pattern. Students from the newer, more diverse section of Cedar Hills face suspension rates 3 times higher than those from the established neighborhoods. Same infractions, different consequences. Michael presented his findings at the monthly board meeting, complete with charts and statistical analysis. Board Chair Patricia Holbrook dismissed it as incomplete methodology and moved to the next item. But Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the district's only Latino board member, asked Michael to email her his full research. That simple request set everything in motion. 3 days later, Michael came home shaken. His laptop had been confiscated during third period for suspected academic dishonesty. No explanation, no due process, just gone. When Sarah called the school, they claimed it was routine investigation. When she asked what he was suspected of, they cited privacy policies. The message was clear. Ask uncomfortable questions. Face uncomfortable consequences. Sarah immediately filed an open records request for all communications between board members regarding Michael's presentation. As a former paralegal, she knew exactly what to ask for. The response came back heavily redacted, but what remained was illuminating. Meanwhile, I started attending every school board meeting, sitting in the front row with a notepad. I said nothing, just took notes. Other parents noticed. By October, our silent section had grown to 12 people, all just observing, all just documenting. Dr. Rodriguez reached out privately. She'd been trying to address equity issues for 2 years, but was consistently outvoted by the 4-member majority led by Holbrook. I have the data, she said, but I need community support to act on it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, the district's own compliance officer, Janet Murray. She'd been quietly documenting policy violations for months, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. When Sarah's records request came through, Janet realized someone was finally paying attention. Janet couldn't speak publicly. Her job depended on discretion, but she could guide us toward information that was already public record. She suggested we examine the superintendent search process from 2 years prior, particularly the scoring rubrics and interview notes. What we found was a systematic pattern of bias. Qualified diverse candidates had been eliminated through subjective cultural fit evaluations, while less qualified candidates from similar backgrounds to board members advanced. The current superintendent, Thomas Wright, had scored lowest on educational experience, but highest on community alignment, whatever that meant. Sarah organized our response with military precision. She created a spreadsheet of every parent, teacher, and community member who'd ever voiced concerns about district policies. She cross-referenced this with voting records, PTA membership, and neighborhood associations. Then she started making phone calls. The strategy was simple. Document everything, build coalitions, and use the system's own rules to demand accountability. We weren't trying to tear anything down. We were trying to make it work the way it was supposed to. Michael's laptop was mysteriously returned after 2 weeks with no explanation. The timing wasn't coincidental. Word had spread about our growing organization, and the administration was testing boundaries. When they realized we weren't going away, they chose tactical retreat over escalation. Our first real victory came in November. Sarah had discovered that the district's disciplinary data was required to be published annually under state law. It hadn't been published in 3 years. A simple phone call to the state compliance office resulted in a formal inquiry and a demand for immediate publication. The data, when it finally appeared on the district website, was exactly what Michael's research had predicted. The disparities were undeniable, documented in the district's own records. Local media picked up the story, and suddenly, our quiet suburban district was facing uncomfortable questions from outside scrutiny. Holbrook called an emergency board meeting to address the misinformation campaign targeting the district. She didn't name us directly, but her meaning was clear. This was our moment to respond. Sarah had prepared for this. She'd spent weeks building relationships with other parents, teachers who were afraid to speak publicly, and community members who'd felt voiceless. When Holbrook opened the floor for public comment, a steady stream of speakers approached the microphone. They weren't angry or confrontational. They were precise, factual, and impossible to dismiss. Teacher after teacher described the pressure they felt to apply discipline policies inconsistently. Parent after parent shared stories of their children being treated differently, based on their neighborhood, their accent, their appearance. Michael spoke last. He didn't repeat his original research. Instead, he presented an analysis of the district's response to his research. The pattern was clear. Rather than address the inequities, the administration had chosen to silence the messenger. The attempted laptop confiscation, the lack of transparency, the delayed data publication, it all painted a picture of an institution more interested in protecting its reputation than protecting its students. The room was silent when he finished. Even Holbrook seemed to
realize that attacking a 16-year-old's
academic integrity in front of his community would be political suicide. Dr. Rodriguez moved to establish an equity committee with community representation and a mandate to review all district policies for discriminatory impact. The motion passed 3-2, with 2 moderate board members breaking ranks with Holbrook. The real work began after that meeting. The equity committee met monthly, reviewing policies, analyzing data, and proposing changes. It was slow, methodical work, exactly the kind of institutional change that lasts because it's built on consensus rather than conflict. Over the following months, the district implemented new disciplinary guidelines with objective criteria and mandatory documentation. Teachers received training on implicit bias. The superintendent search process was revised to include community input and transparent scoring. Holbrook resigned quietly in March, citing personal reasons. Her replacement was Dr. Amanda Foster, an education policy expert who'd served on equity committees in 3 previous districts. The board majority shifted, and suddenly reforms that had been impossible became routine. Michael graduated with honors and a full scholarship to Reed College, where he's studying public policy. His senior thesis on educational equity became a model for student advocacy programs in districts across the state. But more importantly, he learned that change doesn't require revolution. It requires persistence, documentation, and faith in democratic processes. The Cedar Hills District now publishes disciplinary data quarterly. The Equity Committee has become a permanent fixture, with rotating community representation. Suspension rates have dropped across all demographics, but the disparities that once defined our system have largely disappeared. Sarah serves on the school board now, elected unofficially after Dr. Rodriguez moved to take a superintendent position in another state. She approaches every issue with the same methodical precision she brought to our original campaign, always asking for data, always questioning assumptions, always looking for the voices that aren't being heard. I learned something profound during those months of quiet resistance. The most powerful tool in a democracy isn't protest or confrontation, it's participation. Showing up, asking questions, demanding transparency, and refusing to be ignored. Change comes not from the loudest voices, but from the most persistent ones. Dr. Rodriguez visits our district occasionally as a consultant, helping other communities navigate similar challenges. She always reminds audiences that sustainable change requires what she calls constructive disruption, using the system's own rules and values to hold it accountable to its promises. The community center where we first organized now hosts monthly forums on local issues. The conversations are civil, fact-based, and focused on solutions rather than blame. People who once felt powerless now see themselves as stakeholders in their community's future. Michael calls home every few weeks, usually with stories about his work with student government or community organizing. He's applying the lessons from Cedar Hills to new challenges, always looking for the data that reveals hidden patterns, always building coalitions of people who share common interests even when they come from different backgrounds. The lake behind our house reflects the sky differently now, clearer somehow, less distorted by ripples of anxiety and fear. The community we fought to change has become the community we always hoped it could be. Accountable, equitable, and genuinely committed to serving all its members. Last month, a family from the other side of town stopped by our house. Their daughter was having trouble at school, being singled out for discipline while other students got warnings for the same behavior. They'd heard about our experience and wanted advice on how to advocate effectively. Sarah pulled out the binder she'd kept from our campaign, copies of every email, every records request, every meeting agenda. Start with documentation, she told them. The system can ignore complaints, but it can't ignore its own data. They left with a roadmap for change and the phone numbers of 3 other families who'd offered to help. The cycle continues, but now it's built into the community's DNA. People know they have power and they know how to use it constructively. The story doesn't end with victory, it ends with vigilance. Democracy isn't a destination. It's a practice that requires constant participation. Cedar Hills works now because people like Sarah serve on boards. People like Dr. Rodriguez ask hard questions. And people like Michael document the gaps between promises and reality. Change doesn't require extraordinary people doing extraordinary things. It requires ordinary people doing the ordinary work of citizenship, paying attention, asking questions, demanding accountability, and refusing to accept "that's just how things are" as an answer. The most powerful lesson from our experience is also the simplest. The system belongs to all of us. But it only works when all of us participate in making it work. Silence isn't neutrality, it's complicity. But participation, even quiet participation, is always a form of power. If you find yourself in a community where fairness feels like a luxury and accountability seems impossible, remember Cedar Hills. Start with documentation, build relationships, use the system's own rules, and never mistake patience for passivity. Change takes time, but it's always possible when good people decide to do the work required to make it happen. The sky still turns purple during Oregon storms, but now when it does, we know exactly what to do: document everything, support each other, and trust that democracy works when we make it work. The ripple effect or success in Cedar Hills didn't happen in isolation. Word spread through social media, education blogs, and parent networks across the Pacific Northwest. Soon we were receiving calls from communities facing similar challenges, districts where data was hidden, policies were inconsistently applied, and parents felt voiceless against entrenched bureaucracies. Sarah started what she called the Transparency Network, a loose coalition of parent advocates who shared strategies, legal templates, and moral support. The network grew organically, connecting families in rural Oregon towns with those in Seattle suburbs, each facing unique challenges but united by common principles. The first major test case came from Riverside, a small timber community 3 hours south. Their high school had implemented a zero-tolerance discipline policy that resulted in a 400% increase in expulsions, disproportionately affecting students from logging families. The principal, Dr. Marcus Webb, claimed he was raising standards and preparing students for the real world. Maria Santos, a single mother whose son Carlos had been expelled for a minor altercation that previously would have resulted in detention, reached out to our network through a mutual contact. Carlos was a senior, 2 months from graduation, with plans to attend Oregon State on a forestry scholarship. One mistake had derailed everything. Sarah and I drove to Riverside on a Saturday morning, bringing copies of our documentation templates and contact information for the civil rights attorney who had advised our equity committee. We met Maria at a coffee shop downtown, a tired-looking woman with calloused hands and determined eyes. "I work double shifts at the mill," she told us. "I don't have time to fight the system, but I can't let them destroy my son's future because they want to make an example." We spent 4 hours walking Maria through the process we developed in Cedar Hills. First, request all records related to Carlos's case. Second, analyze similar incidents and their outcomes. Third, document any procedural violations. Fourth, build community support through data rather than emotion. The records request revealed what we suspected. Carlos's expulsion had been processed without several required steps, including proper notification of his right to appeal, and mandatory consideration of alternative consequences. More damaging was the pattern we uncovered. Similar incidents involving students from established families had resulted in in-school suspension or community service, but Riverside wasn't Cedar Hills. The community was smaller, more insular, and the power dynamics were different. Dr. Webb had been principal for 15 years and served on the city council. His brother owned the largest timber operation in the county. Challenging him meant challenging the town's entire power structure. Maria's first school board meeting was a disaster. She presented her evidence professionally, but the 5-member board barely listened. Board Chair Robert Manning, Dr. Webb's longtime golf partner, dismissed her concerns as a disgruntled parent making excuses for bad behavior. The meeting was over in 20 minutes. That's when we learned our second crucial lesson. Documentation without political power is just paperwork. Sarah suggested a different approach. Instead of fighting Dr. Webb directly, we would focus on the policy itself. The zero-tolerance policy had been implemented without proper community input, in violation of the district's own governance bylaws. If we could force a policy review, we could address Carlos's case as part of a broader systemic issue. The breakthrough came from an unexpected ally, Jennifer Webb, Dr. Webb's daughter-in-law and a third-grade teacher in the district. She'd been quietly documenting the policy's impact on younger students, watching as kindergartners were suspended. For playground conflicts that should have been resolved with conversation and guidance, Jennifer couldn't speak publicly. Her job and marriage would be at risk, but she could provide documentation that would be impossible to dismiss. Her records showed that the elementary school's suspension rate had tripled since the new policy, with children as young as 5 being sent home for behaviors that experts considered developmentally normal. Working through intermediaries, Jennifer helped us understand the district's internal dynamics. Dr. Webb had implemented the policy after pressure from the state over standardized test scores. His theory was that removing problem students would improve the learning environment for everyone else. It was educational triage disguised as high standards. Sarah organized a series of community forums, not to attack Dr. Webb or the board, but to discuss what kind of education the community wanted for its children. She invited speakers from Oregon State's Education Department, child psychologists from Portland, and, most importantly, recent graduates who could speak to their experiences. The forums were held at the community center, neutral ground away from the charged atmosphere of school board meetings. Sarah made sure every session was recorded and live-streamed, with transcripts available online. This wasn't about secret deals or backroom politics, it was about transparent community dialogue. The first forum drew 20 people. The second drew 50. By the fourth, we had over 100 community members engaged in substantive discussions about discipline policies, educational equity, and the long-term health of their school system. Dr. Webb made a critical error during the third forum. He attended to defend his policy but became defensive when questioned by parents. Instead of presenting data or evidence, he fell back on authority and tradition. "I've been doing this for 15 years, he said. "I think I know what's best for our students." That phrase, "I think I know what's best," became a rallying cry for parents who felt excluded from decisions affecting their children. Sarah made sure it was prominently featured in every subsequent forum announcement. The momentum shifted when Carlos himself spoke at the fourth forum. He didn't make excuses or ask for pity. Instead, he presented a statistical analysis he'd conducted as part of his senior project, comparing Riverside's discipline data with similar districts across Oregon. His methodology was rigorous, his conclusions devastating. "I'm not asking you to excuse what I did," he said. "I'm asking you to look at the data and decide if this policy is making our school better or just different. Because the numbers show we're removing students from education at rates that don't match our community's values." The room was silent. Here was a young man whose future had been derailed by the policy, presenting objective analysis of its impact. He wasn't angry or resentful. He was thoughtful and precise. The contrast with Dr. Webb's emotional defensiveness was stark. 3 days later, the school board announced they were forming a policy review committee with community representation. Carlos's case would be reconsidered as part of a broader evaluation of the district's disciplinary approach. The policy review took 6 months. The committee included parents, teachers, students, and community members, with an outside facilitator from the Oregon School Boards Association. Every meeting was public, every document was available online, every recommendation was backed by research and data. The final report was damning. The zero-tolerance policy had failed by every meaningful measure. Academic performance hadn't improved. School climate surveys showed increased anxiety and fear, and the disproportionate impact on working class families was statistically undeniable. Carlos was readmitted to school and completed his graduation requirements through a combination of credit recovery and community service. He started at Oregon State the following fall, a year later than planned, but with a deeper understanding of how institutions function and how change happens. Dr. Webb announced his retirement at the end of the school year. His replacement, Dr. Angela Martinez, had spent 10 years implementing restorative justice programs in California. She brought a completely different philosophy. Discipline should teach, not just punish, and every student deserved multiple opportunities to succeed. The network grows. The Riverside success attracted national attention. Sarah was invited to speak at education conferences, and our documentation templates were downloaded thousands of times by parent advocates across the country. What had started as a response to our local challenges had evolved into a model for community-driven education reform. But growth brought new challenges. Not every community had the resources or expertise to replicate our approach. Some districts were more resistant than others, and we were learning that sustainable change required more than just winning individual battles. It required changing the culture of how communities engaged with their schools. The next major test came from an unexpected direction: a wealthy suburban district outside Seattle, where parents were complaining about grade inflation and lowered standards. Roosevelt Heights. Academy was a high-performing district with test scores in the top 10% statewide, but a vocal group of parents felt their children weren't being adequately challenged. The complaint seemed different from our previous cases. This was about academic rigor rather than equity or fairness. But when we looked deeper, familiar patterns emerged. The parents pushing for higher standards were predominantly from the district's most expensive neighborhoods. The changes they proposed would disproportionately impact students who were already struggling, many from the district's small population of lower-income families. Lisa Kim, a software engineer and single mother, contacted our network after her daughter Amy was moved from advanced classes to more appropriate coursework. Amy was half Korean, raised by her mother after her father's death when she was 8. Lisa worked long hours and couldn't provide the extensive academic support that many Roosevelt Heights families took for granted. The reclassification was presented as being in Amy's best interest. She would be less stressed, more successful in classes matched to her ability level. But Lisa recognized it for what it was: tracking based on social class rather than academic potential. This case was particularly challenging because the discrimination was subtle, wrapped in the language of student welfare and academic excellence. Amy's grades were fine, her test scores were solid, but she lacked the enrichment experiences and family academic support that counselors considered essential for advanced coursework. Sarah and I traveled to Roosevelt Heights on a fact-finding mission. The district was impressive, well-funded, high-tech, with facilities that looked more like a college campus than a high school. But beneath the surface, we found a rigid sorting system that channeled students into predetermined paths based as much on family background as academic ability. The key insight came from Dr. Patricia Nguyen, a Vietnamese-American chemistry teacher who had been quietly documenting these patterns for 3 years. Students with Asian surnames were often praised for their work ethic, but discouraged from leadership roles or creative pursuits. Students from working families were steered toward practical classes regardless of their interests or abilities. "It's not malicious," Dr. Nguyen explained during a coffee meeting off campus. Most of the staff genuinely believe they're helping students by managing their expectations. But the result is a self-fulfilling prophecy, where opportunity is distributed based on zip code and surname. The Roosevelt Heights case required a different strategy. This wasn't about obvious policy violations or clear statistical disparities. It was about implicit bias and institutional culture, much harder to document and challenge through traditional advocacy methods. Lisa took the lead, organizing what she called data walks, groups of parents who would review publicly available information about course enrollment, graduation outcomes, and post-secondary placement. They met monthly at the public library, carefully analyzing patterns and trends in the district's own reports. What they found was striking.